Hey woodworkers. So my next step for the tabletop is to cut out for this medallion. So as we talked about before, I traced out this template and the template looks good. What I've done is I've carried the lines over where I want this to start and stop, and then just brought them down so that when I line this thing up, I have the center line and the center line on the table. And if I do that, then it's going to be slightly offset a little bit. So by going start and stop here, it becomes a bit more of an accurate gauge of where I'm at. So what I like to do is draw out a line here. I'll flip the template around, do the same thing again, referencing starting and stopping points, lining up the edges here in the back of the table. Once I've done that, I can pull this away and I'm going to look for the lines intersecting or overlapping. And if I see two really large lines, or one with a different curve, or a high spot or a low spot, then I'll know I have to revisit making my template. But as it stands now, I've got one singular line, and just as a reminder, what I did to make this was on an edge sander on the end of that piece with the drum. I just went in here, took off most of the material on a bandsaw, and then just going opposite direction of the rotation, I would push in and against that rotation very lightly and keeping my hands moving the whole time. So I've got that. I'm happy with this. Lining this thing up. My veneer is actually in great shape, except for I got a little bit of tearing out here, if you remember from the veneer video, and that could have been addressed, but because I'm doing this medallion piece, I knew that wasn't going to be a factor. So I'm just going to put this thing in, all of that goes away. Alright, so I need to hold this piece in place, and I'm going to clamp it. Because I need to get some clamps underneath this whole system, I have some blocks here and here to elevate the work, and then I've got a bigger board underneath this to serve two functions. Basically, it will act to distribute some of the pressure, but it'll also act as a clamping pad, so I'm not denting or bruising the underside of the tabletop. So I can do this here. Now, location of these clamps is kind of critical. This one, because I'm going to be using a handheld router, is going to get in the way. And so this is the router I'm going to be using, and I could maybe kind of sneak through here, but it gets awfully awkward with my hands making contact with this and where the handles are. So I'm going to actually clamp on the opposite edge here. The size of the MDF allowed me to do this, so I have a couple of options. So by doing this, I have full pressure onto this little template I've made without any interference, either physically in the way or kind of a convenience factor for what it is I'm doing. Okay, so this is ready to go. Now, the router I've already told you I'm going to be using, a bit similar to this. It's a pattern maker bit, so it has a bearing here on the bottom, and then the length of this cutter is going to be kind of in question. So there are different lengths of these things to use, and this one is way too long because if you envision, as this cut is going to be made, the bearing needs to ride against our template, right? That's the whole point of this. So, and I don't necessarily need to plunge too deep into the tabletop to make this cut. I want to make this about 1/8 of an inch, give or take. If I go too deep, it's fine. It's a thicker piece on the back here to cut. There's no real structural issue with that, but I want to go fairly shallow. Alright, so this is going to force me, because of the location of the bearing, to plunge way deeper than I want to go. The shallower one is a little bit better, but it's still a little bit too deep. So the bit that I have mounted into the router, it's a fairly short cutter. I think this is a 1/2 inch length of cutter, and that one is perfect for what it is I want to do. So running the router in here, taking a couple of passes until I can get that bearing engaged and run it all the way around for my final cut. I already have the depth of cut stopped, or I have a stop for the depth of cut. So I'm ready to go with this. This is a plunge base router, but I could have easily used a fixed base as well. This one, as long as I don't move the position of that cutter, then I should be in good shape. All right, hopefully that all makes sense. Putting on hearing protection, eye protection, and here we go. One quick note about this. I'm going to have to go with the cutter from left to right instead of right to left. If I go right to left, I'm getting into that climb cut situation, and I don't want this router to start coming away from me. So I'll set the base down, making sure the bearing's not touching, the cutter's not touching anything, and then just slowly kind of carve out this material. All right, here we go. Nothing to it. If you had a smaller piece or you're worried about this thing moving, I guess I should have mentioned this before I was cutting. I like this setup here, and it's going to be awfully tough to kind of push and advance this forward. So by clamping this thing down, it's going to be secured, and that's really the name of the game. If I needed to, I could also clamp in other areas to support all of this, to give some opposite pressure to where the router is going to be forcing in. Alright, so now after all of that, I'm done with that tool. Let me kind of get in here to show you what I've done. Okay, so this is preparation for filling this space. Oops. Yeah, that's much more exciting. Yeah, cool. Okay, so you can see I'm getting into some of the solid wood edging here. Ruh-roh. One day I shall have a camera person. All right, hopefully that'll be better. Okay, so exposing a little bit of the MDF. The thing that's important here is that there is no damage to the veneer, and part of the whole purpose and the benefit of this template that we used is that supports the veneer and it clamps it down so that there's very little opportunity for that cutter to tear out any of the veneer, which would be just a disaster if you got to this point and then you're introducing some tearing out of veneer. Difficult to repair, but in essence you'd have to start over a little bit with that veneer, or in total, which would totally suck. Alright, so now I want to fill this with some kind of solid wood. It's basically, it's not technically a veneer, it's a thicker inlay. And so with doing that, I'm going to choose a material that I think complements the design and works and so on and so forth. And so I think a darker wood, ebony is an easy one, that's great. A rosewood, if you can find them, that's great. Babinga could be a little bit too red with the reds of this species of wood, but what I thought would be fun was to introduce a little bit of lace wood into this. So I'm going to cut this lace wood piece here. I've milled it down to, I would say this is close to 1/4 of an inch, give or take, and the depth of cut that I've made here is about half that. It's about 1/8 of an inch. So I have plenty of extra thickness here, which is great. And the other thing that's of note is the peak of this curve. If I start carving this thing out, we'll have plenty of excess material to overhang on the back, which is critically important. So what I'm going to do is transfer this so I have the shape what I wanted. I think this is probably a better area. It's a little bit less busy. This is just a lot of those radial flecks, which are beautiful, but for the small environment this is going to occupy, I think less is more in this application. Alright, so once I've selected that, I'm going to take my template and I'm going to line up the peak of this curve to the edge of the board. And with that, transferring this to where I want to be. So I'm just going to freehand continue out this curve. It doesn't have to be accurate, because once I've got this cut out, I'm going to take out this material on the bandsaw, and then I'll fine-tune this cut to match the space via a disc sander. So disc sanders are kind of the perfect tool for this. I used an edge sander, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to force you to go out and buy more equipment if you don't need it, but it is the right tool for the job. And I say that because the edge sander would be way too much force on a piece this small, and so the rotation of that belt that's driving this thing on the edge sander would be very easy for this to kind of catch and pull away. So it's a lot more aggressive regardless of the abrasive that you have. So if it's 120 grit or more, it's still going to be way too aggressive. But with a disc sander, I can kind of go in and fine tune and hit these areas in a way that are not really forceful. All the force is going to be going down across the grain in this, and I can slowly start to walk this over a disc sander. And I'm going to also bring my template with me, so that as I'm at the disc sander, I'll be able to fit these things back and forth to my template. If it fits on the template, it's going to fit here. If it doesn't, then this template has shifted somehow in your routing. But this is a mirror image of what we were doing on our template. Okay, so that's done. I've got this away, and because I was a Cub Scout, I prepared for this conversation and I fit this guy in here. A couple things to note. I've got a little bit of damage here on this outside edge. I'm not worried about that at all for two reasons. Number one, there's a lot more thickness on this piece of lace wood, and there's a lot more width here. So I'm going to be trimming this off one way or the other. So the damage I'm not worried about. The other thing is that in fine-tuning this, there is, and there will always be for every curve that you're doing, kind of a perfect position. And so I want to line this up center line to the center line, so that when I'm gluing this thing on, if there's any squeeze out, I'll know what my reference is and the squeeze out won't get in the way. But that looks pretty good. Pretty good. All right. Yeah, still going to be happy with you. All right. So now that that's there, it's time for gluing. So let me throw some glue on this, and then we'll get to the fun part, which is going to be trimming off the extra material. In this application, I'd probably be tempted to go with white glue. There's nothing wrong with yellow glue as I'm using here, save one point worth note that white glue dries clear, and so it hides some sins in a different way. Yellow glue kind of has this hue to it, or this color. So, and the only reason I'm not, I can hear the question you're asking, the only reason I'm not using white glue now is that my white glue bottle dried up. And so I have to go with this. Alright, so that's in there. I'm going to, this is a better piece. I want to put a platen on the back of this just to distribute some of this pressure. So I'll do this, line this thing up. And I've got platens top and bottom, so really don't have a choice. This is going to be pretty fantastic when I'm done. Okay, so that's the glue up here. Sorry, let me see if I can't show you a little bit of a different view. Does it feel like you're watching the Blair Witch Project yet? Okay, so that's what it looks like from another view, and the squeeze out is kind of the critical piece that I'm looking for. So I can go in there and do my toothbrush trick, get the toothbrush wet and kind of scrub out all this glue. This platen is in the way, so I can't get underneath it. That becomes a bit of a problem. but I do want to look to make sure that I've got a nice tight connection. So in other words, I don't want any cold creep from clamping this down too tightly and having the board or the lacewood piece for our medallion kind of slide out of position. What I've done is I've tried to position the bottom of the clamp at a bit of an angle so that as I clamp it down, it fits tighter and tighter into that spot. Hopefully that made sense to you. And then what I'm going to do is let this dry. I'm not going to go in and clean out this glue for the thing I talked about with the platen. But the other thing is, it's not the end of the world, but I really don't want to introduce any moisture to the veneered surface here. Anytime I add water to this, it's going to start to swell one face and then not the other, and that sometimes causes enough of cupping or lifting of the veneer to pull away from the substrate. And again, that's just something that's so easy to avoid. I don't want to tempt fate here and get into doing that. So I'm going to leave this here, and I will carve it out, hopefully in an interesting way, on the next video. So I'll give this about a half an hour or so to dry, and then I'll show you how to do the last step of this, and then we go from there. All right, thanks everyone.